Hi, and welcome to Lesson 5a. This lesson is all about functions in Python. So, what is a function? Let's see if I can advance the page here and we'll see. Okay, good programmers look for opportunities all the time to be able to reuse their code. There's a reason for this. It's faster. There's fewer errors to find and correct if you reuse code that's already been tested. And it also allows you to leverage the expertise of others. Now, that may not make as much sense in a class where you're writing all your own programs, but suppose you're working for a company and there's 15 programmers working on the same project. You would like some of them to be able to do some work that you use in your programs. Now, one way to do this is you can just copy and paste code within your own program. You probably did this in the programming assignment for weeks 3 and 4 because you had to get the median and the max and the min and the mean value for all of the data, and for just the males and for just the females and for just the males of a certain age range and for just the females of a certain age range and so on. You may have written the same code 6, 8, 10, 12 times. Let's see if there's a better way to do that. Copying and pasting works fine if you never need to change the code. But suppose you wrote some code and pasted it in 5 different places, and then you decided there was a better way to do it. You'd have to change it in 5 different places. And maybe you'd forget to change it in one of them. Or you'd change it a little bit differently in one of them, and suddenly code that was working before doesn't work anymore. So as an alternative, you can define functions in Python. We've used functions, we just haven't written them. We've used functions that were written by people who created our Python libraries. So let's be able to do the same thing ourselves. Here's how we define a function. We use the def for define keyword. Then we put in a function name, whatever we want to call our function. Then in parentheses, we have whatever parameters, that's values we want to pass into the function, and then a colon that indicates this is going to be an indented block. Everything that's at the next indent level is part of the function. It does not get executed until you call the function. All it does is say, hey, you're calling this function name, I'm going to remember this, and anytime you tell me to do function name, I'll do all of these statements. So here's an example. I'm going to define a function whose name is biggest alternating, and it takes one parameter, and that parameter is going to be called list. What do I want it to do? I want it to go through the list, taking every other element, so all the alternating elements, and then tell me what is the biggest number of all of those alternate elements. So within my function, I'm going to create a variable called alternate that consists of, remember this slice notation from week 2? Here's a list. I'm not telling it a start, I'm not telling it an end, so it'll start at the beginning, end at the end, but take every other value. So it'll give me position 0, position 2, position 4, and so on, of whatever is in the variable list. And then it's going to return the max of this new list called alternate that only has position 0, position 2, and so on. Okay, now how does this work? Let's say I create a list called L that has all of these elements, 5, -3, 2, 1, 19, and so on. And a list called M that has 5, -3, 2, 19, 100, and so on. Now if I do a print biggest alternating of L and biggest alternating of M, whenever I use the name of the function, it will execute all the code of the function, taking this variable, L, the list that has all of these elements in it, and binding it to the name list inside the function. So what will happen? It will take the list L, take every other element, and find the biggest one. Let's see what it should be. 5, 2, 19, 17. The biggest of those numbers was 19. And then it's going to do biggest alternating of M. 5 to 125. The biggest of those is 100. So this print statement would print out the values 19 and 100. You can have as many functions as you want defined in Python. There's no limit. Define one function, define two functions, define 5 functions. Use a separate def or define block for each one. Functions can have 0 parameters, in which case when you define them in the def block, you just put parenthesis with nothing in between it. It can have 1 parameter, like the example we just saw for the alternating function on the previous page, or it can have more than 1 parameter. You separate parameters by commas. The parameter names are defined only within the function block itself. Whatever variable name you want to give it within the function block lives only within that function block. It may be the same as a variable you're using in your main code. It might be different. Doesn't matter. Whenever a return statement is executed, the function stops and passes back a value to the statement that called it. Now, the statement that called it may or may not use that value, but a function returns it. In our previous example, we did use the return value because we printed out biggest alternating of L and biggest alternating of M. What value got printed out? Whatever got returned from biggest alternating. If your return statement has a value after it, return a number, return max of this, return a character, then that's the value that gets returned. If your return statement is just the word return and it doesn't pass a value back, then it still returns something. It returns the special value none. And you can have more than one return statement in a function. Only one will get executed, but maybe you've got something that says, if something's true, return this value, else return a different value. You could have more than one return statement. Once a return statement is executed, though, you go back to whoever called the function. We can have default parameter values in a function. Inside the definition of a function, we put, here's the parameters I'm going to use. We can specify a default value for one or more of them in case somebody doesn't pass in a value. So here I'm going to define a function called print A and B. What's it going to do? It's going to just print out the value of A and the value of B. So what parameters does print A and B take? Takes parameter called A, takes parameter called B. Whatever is passed in as A gets printed, whatever is passed in as B gets printed. But notice when I'm defining this, A is just the name of the variable, B says B equals 7. That's a default value that says if when you call the function print A and B, you don't tell me what B is, then I'll use a 7. If you do tell me what B is, I'll use your value. So this 7 is just a default. So what happens? If I call print A and B with a 6 and an 8, the output will be 6, 8. If I call print A and B with just a 6, what happens? This 6 goes into the first parameter. I did not give it a second parameter, so it will have a default value of 7. And what gets printed from this second one is the numbers 6 and 7. Now, when we call a function, we typically pass in parameters in the order they were defined in the function. In the function on the previous page, you pass in A, then you pass in B. This is called using positional parameters. The one in the first position gets bound to the first variable name, the one in the second position gets bound to the second variable name, and so on. But we don't have to pass the parameters in order if we specify which parameter we want to pass a value in for. Let's say we know something takes A and B, but we didn't remember if A went first or if B went first. We could still pass something in by saying function name, parenthesis, B equals 7, comma, A equals 14. Even if the function had A first and B next. We can put them in any order we want. Here's some examples. Let's see, I went the wrong direction. Let's page down. Here's a parameter example where I've got a function called rectangle. And a rectangle takes two parameters, length and width. What does it do when it gets the length and width? It prints out length and the value of length, width and the value of width, area and the value of length times width. which we all remember is the area of a rectangle. So if I call rectangle 510, I'd expect it to say length is 5, width is 10, area is 5 times 10, or 50. How about if I call rectangle saying width equals 10, length equals 5? These names have to be the names of the parameters as they're defined on the DEF statement, but they can be in any order. I said width equals 10, that 10 is going to go to this parameter. I said length equals 5, that 5 is going to go to that parameter. So in other words, rectangle 510 does exactly the same thing as rectangle width equals 10, length equals 5 does. They both print out length 5, width 10, area 50. Here's another example. I'm going to define a function called multiply all that takes 4 parameters, a, b, c, and d. Notice I've given a default value to c and to d of 1. What does it do? It returns a times b times c times d. So it'll just multiply all 4 of these together. If I call multiply all, passing it a 4 and a 5, the 4 goes in as a, the 5 goes in as b. Since I didn't specify a c or a d, those have values of 1 and 1. So it returns 4 times 5 times 1, or 20. Now if I do 4, 5, d equals 2, 4 goes in for a, 5 goes in for b. I didn't give it a c, so that takes its default value of 1. I did give it a d, so it'll use my value of 2, not the default value of 1. So I get 4 times 5 times 1 times 2. That one will return a value of 40. I can specify all 4 of the parameters, but do them in a different order. D is 2, C is 3, A is 4, B is 5. It will return 4 times 5 times 3 times 2, or 120. I can specify 4 and 5 without saying A equals and B equals, because I'm just going to do it positionally. My first parameter is a 4, first parameter was A. My second parameter is a 5, second parameter was a B. Then after that, I'll do it by keyword, by name. D is 2, C is 3. What happens? I multiply A times B times C times D. 4 times 5 times 3 times 2, I get 120. Now, what if I do C equals 3, D equals 2, then a 4, then a 5? This one won't work. Python won't let you do this statement. It'll come back with an error. It'll say, I'm sorry, you've got some positional parameters that you didn't tell me about. First position, A, didn't have a default. You have to specify it. You didn't specify it because you don't have something in position 1 that could go to A. The thing you put in position 1 is going to C. And you didn't have anything else where you said A equals. So this one gives you an error. The next one also gives you an error. It'll say 4. I know what that is. That goes in for A. Now I'm expecting the next thing to be a B. Oh, you don't have another positional parameter. All you've given me is a keyword parameter, and that keyword parameter is for D. Well, D's okay, A was okay, C's okay because it's got a default value, but you never gave me anything for B. So these last two don't work. The others are all ways of specifying parameters going in. Now, what else can we do with functions? We can put in what's called a starred parameter. In a function definition, you can specify your last parameter with a star for a prefix, the asterisk. When you call the function, you specify any number of values for this starred parameter. The function treats them as a tuple. Remember those from our previous lessons? A tuple is a list that's immutable. A bunch of values that are in a sequence, but you can't change them. So if I have a function called starred parameters, and I say it's taking two things, first and rest. First parameter, rest of the parameters. But I put a star in front of rest here. That means whenever I call it, I can give it one parameter that goes into first, and everything else gets packed up into a tuple and goes into the variable called rest. Now what am I going to do? I'm going to print out first, and I'm going to print out all the rest. Here I'm passing all of them to the print statement. So when I do starred parameters, giving it 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1 goes into first, and the tuple, parenthesis 2, 3, 4, goes into the variable rest. So what gets printed out? First one, rest 2, 3, 4. And if inside the function I had typed in what is type rest, it would tell me it was class tuple. Notice rest without a star. If I did what's the length of rest, it would tell me 3. So these two things I just typed in for you here to show you what those values are, even though the function didn't print them out. So hopefully you're going to get some practice using all of these variations of functions. The quiz that you're going to do this week has lots and lots of variations of positional parameters, keyword parameters, starred parameters, default parameters, and so on. The best way for you to do the quiz is going to be to open up IDLE and type in or paste in the quiz fragments of code and see what happens. Play around with them. Make sure you understand them. You're going to learn this best by doing. Thanks a lot.